thank you for being here and for being part of Water Watchdogs. You guys are the ones who are going to help us speak up for the river during this legislative session. And we're super grateful for you for being here and for the actions that you take every legislative session. So tonight is our first virtual briefing where we're really kind of getting started this year for the 2023 Montana legislature. And we'll hear from Alex Leone, our restoration policy manager, and Andrew Gorder, who is our legal director. They've got about a 20-25 minute presentation. And then we'll have some time for questions and answers. I'll introduce you to Julia Crocker, who is our community programs coordinator. And then we'll hear briefly from Karen Knudsen. So we're going to fit all of that into 1 hour. And we've got some resources to share with you. And this is just the beginning. So we're going to keep going with this for the next 90 days. So to get things started, I'm going to just start right away with Alex. Alex, like I said, is our restoration policy manager. He's based in Anaconda. He's a stream restoration scientist and a policy analyst. And he works with the public resource managers, landowners, university students and professors, and the general public to design and implement restoration projects and studies that improve the Clark Fork River and its tributaries. He's going to give you some background on the legislature, and then we're going to hear from Andrew Gorder. Andrew tracks, researches, and analyzes policies related to water quality and water quantity. And he also lobbies on behalf of clean water at the state legislature. Andrew has a law degree from the University of Montana and has been practicing water law for over 10 years. So with that, I'm going to kick it over to you guys, Alex and Andrew.
Thanks a ton, Sam. And thanks everyone for sticking through the technical snafu, but we appreciate you sticking around and letting us chat with you about the legislative session. So I'm going to start by just giving kind of a broad overview on the 2022 election in Montana and how that kind of shaped what we're seeing in the legislature in 2023, which is active and ongoing right now. Andrew. So to just first give everyone an overview, I know it was a long time ago. It wasn't that long ago, but it feels like it was a long time ago. After the election in November, we saw some shifts in both the Montana House and the Montana Senate. In the Montana House, this map right here just kind of shows that the Republicans netted one seat from the last legislative session, which was 2 years ago. So there was one net pickup in the House, and then also in the Senate, there were 3 net seats that were picked up by the Republicans in the Senate. So that made this current legislative session a little bit different. Andrew, if you want to go to the next slide. For the first time in Montana's modern constitutional history, because of those changes that we saw in the House and the Senate, we have a supermajority. And what that means is that one party has 2/3 control of both the Montana House and the Montana Senate. And that gives that party quite a bit of control in rulemaking if they're all on the same page. It allows them to override a governor's veto and it allows them to overrule the minority party for the most part. I think one of the things to note is that what kind of caused this supermajority was some changing demographics in the state of Montana. The big seats that were changed in the legislature over the last election really occurred in Great Falls, where almost all the seats went Republican for the first time in a long time. And then also in Anaconda and Deer Lodge, due to growing demographics and kind of changing demographics in both Granite County. And in Anaconda, we saw a Senate seat and a House seat in Anaconda go Republican. The Senate seat that went Republican was Mark Sweeney's former Senate seat, and that was the first time that had been a Republican in that seat in over 60 years. So some pretty big changes occurring in parts of Montana. One thing I want to note too, and Andrew's going to get into this a little bit more, is that a supermajority is tenuous. It's only a supermajority when everybody agrees. So, and Montanan politicians are known for kind of breaking away from party line very often. Next slide. And this is my last slide. And then Andrew's going to get into the dirty details. Some silver linings, I think, that we're starting to see already in this session is that we've seen a lot of moderates appointed to Senate leadership positions and a lot of veterans as well. So folks that have been around a while have worked across the aisle, and that's been good. Another thing that we've seen, and Andrew's going to talk about this a little bit more, is that there have been several good bills. A supermajority has the ability to get things done, and some of the things that they're getting done in the water sphere is good. And Andrew will talk about that. And then one other thing is that we've noticed is some of the governor's priorities, like tax cuts and other things, red tape, removing red tape has really taken up a lot of the bandwidth so far. So water, environmental policy, and mining stuff has not been a huge part of the session so far. Andrew Gorder, our legal director, is going to take it from here and kind of get into a little bit more of the nitty gritty on what we're seeing and some of the CFC's top priorities. Andrew, I'll let you take it.
Awesome. Thanks, Alex. And thanks again to everyone for tuning in. Your presence is really appreciated and really important when it comes to speaking up on behalf of clean water and the environment at the legislature. So appreciate your attendance. So I'm going to start just by talking about our general policy goals and then get into the details of kind of what we're tracking so far this session. What's CFC's policy goals at the legislature? Number one, we want to promote common sense legislation to protect Montana's waters. We want to prevent backsliding on our existing water quality and water quantity laws. And then last but not least, we want to defend Montana's Constitution, including, of course, our clean and healthful environment provision. So how does that translate to priorities for this legislative session? Number one, we want to protect our ability to restore dewatered streams in our watershed and improve sort of the administrative processes that we need to convert water rights to in-stream flow. This is something that CFC has been involved in for a long time as part of our restoration program. And I'll get into some positives in the legislative session we've seen so far on that front. But that's certainly a priority. Number two, as everybody I'm sure is aware, housing supply and affordable housing needs are a huge concern statewide right now in Montana. As a result, we're likely going to see a lot, and we've already seen quite a bit of legislation aimed at sort of land use, zoning, and subdivision, all in the name of cutting red tape, as Alex mentioned, to create housing. And don't want to downplay that at all. Housing is certainly an enormous issue, particularly affordable housing, that the legislature should address. But what we don't want to see is any cutting back of our safeguards for the environment and water resources in the name of cutting red tape. We also want to see a clear nexus between what's being proposed in terms of policy and actual the ability to create affordable housing. So priority number three, we want to protect our common sense mining laws. That includes the so-called bad actor provision, which many of you have probably heard about before. We want to prevent the widening of the exempt well loophole, which I'll discuss quite a bit later on in my presentation. And then again, we want to defend our constitutional right to a clean and healthful environment. So just looking at the numbers, where things are at so far, we're at the fourth week. So legislative day 22 or 23, I believe. And this is the number. This is just a graph that I pulled off the legislature's website showing progress so far in terms of the number of bills that are in progress and then the number of bills that have actually been introduced. So quite a bit of activity. We're sort of on par for what we normally would be seeing at this point in the session, although there are some high points on that lower graph you see for the number of bills being introduced. There's certainly a lot of activity in terms of bill draft requests. We've got about 4,500 total right now, and at this point, 675 have actually been introduced. 96 of those bill requests are related to water in some form or fashion, and then 15 water bills have been introduced at this point. So we're going to break down the discussion today in terms of the good, the bad, and the ugly. So we'll start off with some positive movement at the legislature. The good. Senate Bill 72, want to start off here. This bill the first two bills I'm going to discuss came out of the last 2 years. There was a significant effort among a whole bunch of water stakeholders to come up with some positive legislation for the future of Montana's water resources. That was led by the DNRC. And the end result were these two bills, Senate Bill 72 and House Bill 114. The first one, what it does is define the future role for the Montana Water Court and solidify the role of the water court, the jurisdiction of the court, and sort of the state's primacy over its own water resources. This is a topic that's been discussed repeatedly at the legislature for the past 20 years. And this bill is actually the first time we've actually seen an effort to take that next step forward and talk about what the water court's going to do after its initial job is completed, the adjudication. This is a really good bill. There's components, like any piece of legislation, it's not perfect. There are things that CFC doesn't necessarily wholeheartedly agree with, but overall, this is a really good bill. It's an important bill, and we hope to see that pass. It's still navigating the Senate. The next one, House Bill 114, is related to that first policy priority that I mentioned, improving the framework we use to restore in-stream flow. So the Clark Fork Coalition currently holds over 30 water rights that are under change authorizations for in-stream flow. And every single one of those water rights has to go through a DNRC process to convert it from its previous use to in-stream flow for the benefit of the fishery. On average, that process has taken us at least 3 to 4 years and hundreds of man hours to get it done. It's an expensive, onerous process that everybody agrees is generally broken and needs to be fixed. This bill, House Bill 114, makes a lot of those fixes. Again, it's not perfect. It doesn't accomplish anything, but it's a huge step forward. It's a bipartisan bill. It's a big bill that CFC, in terms of our priorities and one that we're advocating for pretty aggressively. So we hope to see, so far things are looking good for that bill, but if it needs any support when it moves over to the Senate side, we'll probably be getting in touch with you folks to help us out and contact your legislators. And then I just want to talk briefly about funding. House Bill 2, there are a number of key priorities for CFC that are built into that package. Montana has a budget surplus right now. We want to see some of that money invested in protecting our water resources. So we've spoken up on behalf of funding for more stream gauges, which are critically important to understanding both what we see on a seasonal basis and then just having yearly data that we can rely on to understand what we have in terms of a water supply and how to manage that supply. DNRC is requesting funding now to add 64 new stream gauges. Those are real-time data providing gauges that show both water quantity and temperature, critically important, and we hope to see that funding improved. We've also supported funding in this House Bill 2 package for the Montana Natural Resource Damage Program, which we work with routinely and was a huge part of securing restoration damages for historical mining activity and damages to natural resources in the Upper Clark Fork Basin. So that's the good. Let's get into the bad. So we'll start with Senate Bill 240. So this is one of those bills that sort of takes a crack at our land use and environmental protection policies in the name of housing, but is just a really poor piece of policy, generally pretty short-sighted. So what it does is exempt certain subdivisions completely from DEQ's environmental review. So the criteria that we're talking about here is if the subdivision is 14 lots or fewer, if it's more than 2 miles from a high quality water, and if they can demonstrate, quote, full compliance with the acquisition of necessary water rights and water availability. If it meets that criteria, they don't have to go through any environmental review. This is just short-sighted policy with no direct relation to housing availability or affordability, and really would have some pretty severe impacts in terms of water resources, water quality, and water quantity. Because currently, this type of subdivision would most likely be relying on exempt wells, which we'll get into more here in a second. So Senate Bill 240, not a good idea. We're going to oppose this bill. The other two are they're drafts at this point. So they haven't actually been introduced. There's a potential that the specifics of these proposals could change, but I wanted to mention them because they touch on these priorities that I discussed at the outset. The first one, LC 0705, would force Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks to recalculate some of its in-stream flow water rights based on biological need for a specific fish species. And it would also assign potentially new priority dates to these water rights. And I think the subtext of this bill is that in-stream flow is a subordinate beneficial use of water and should be last in line when it comes to water right needs. That's obviously not anywhere in Montana policy. That's a policy goal, I think, that's certainly held by a minority of Montanans, which most of us recognize in-stream flow, and the courts have agreed in-stream flow is most definitely a beneficial use. We want to keep it that way. So any attack on FWP's in-stream flow water rights and the ability to change water rights to in-stream flow to protect fisheries, we want to stand up and support FWP, and so we'll be opposing this bill if it gets introduced. The other concern that we have is that if you can do this for FWP, you can do it for any private water right as well, which would include our in-stream flow water rights, or really any water users' rights, whether that be irrigation, domestic, municipal, et cetera. So bad idea. We're going to oppose that bill if it gets introduced. The next one, LC 0833. This is a bill that we saw last session that died, thanks in part to water watchdogs and other stakeholders standing up and saying this is not a good policy proposal, but it's been resurrected again for this session. What it would do is limit who can object to a new water right permit that's being proposed or a change to an existing water right, unless you own a water right that could be adversely impacted. So it's who has standing to object to essentially a new use of water. The problem here, of course, is that Montana's water resources belong to all Montanans, not just those who hold water rights. This proposal also conflicts clearly with existing Montana Supreme Court precedent. I think that the subtext or the background of this bill is likely related to some efforts to intervene in the proposed Smith River mine. So some people who are proponents of that mine want to cut off any ability for the public to participate in this respect in the future. Again, not a good idea. We were successful in killing this same bill last session, and we'll try to do the same thing this time. Okay, so let's get into the ugly now. I'm going to spend a chunk of time talking about exempt wells, because this is an issue that has been of interest to the Clark Fork Coalition and our members for quite some time, and is really critically important given the pressures of growth that we're seeing in Montana right now. But I just want to start with some background here. So what is an exempt well? Like its name, these wells are groundwater appropriations that are exempt from the permitting requirements of the Montana Water Use Act. These were originally, when the Water Use Act was passed in 1973, this exemption was intended to allow for sort of small rural dispersed users to drill some low impact wells without the burdens of going through that permitting process. It's limited to 35 gallons per minute in flow rate and 10 acre feet of water a year. But the concern, of course, is what about cumulative impacts from multiple wells that are being drilled? What about impacts to water users and water resources if these wells are being drilled next to streams? We all know that groundwater and surface water are connected. So what the law says is you can get an exempt well as long as you meet the requirements, but a combined appropriation, so any two or more wells from the same source aquifer still require a permit. So the question has always been, what is a combined appropriation? Well, due to development pressure, kind of starting in the 90s, Montana DNRC, which is tasked with enforcing Montana's Water Use Act, decided to redefine what a combined appropriation was. And they said it only means two or more wells that are actually physically connected. That is, as long as the wells are not connected, there was no limit to the number of exempt wells that you could drill for any specific subdivision or a specific development project. So it sort of opened the floodgates. And following DNRC's definition, 3 out of every 4 wells in Montana that was drilled was exempt. And 50% or more of those were being drilled in closed basins. So those are watersheds, sub-basins where you cannot get a new water right permit, but you were still being allowed to drill an exempt well. And all exempt wells, they don't have to meet any of the requirements that are other permits are subject to. So no analysis of water availability or impacts to neighboring users, no notice to other water users, and no metering or reporting requirements to actually quantify how much water is being pumped. So you can kind of see in the bottom right corner there how this plays out on the ground. So you see in that picture, the irrigated field that's under pivot irrigation for that 160 acres, we'll say, requires a permit. But that subdivision right next to it, you previously could drill as many wells as you wanted, no permit required. So many of you are probably aware that CFC litigated this issue starting in 2010. We challenged that definition of combined appropriation as contrary to the Montana Water Use Act. We were successful in that litigation. We got a district court ruling, I believe, in 2014, and that went to the Montana Supreme Court, and the district court's ruling was upheld in 2017. And so as a result, that definition of combined appropriation that makes no hydrologic sense was nullified, and we went back to the pre-existing rule. So what happened after that was pretty interesting. DNRC issued some administrative rules to interpret the court rulings, but they really continued business as usual in terms of actually allowing exempt wells. And the reasons for that are a little bit fuzzy, but we can speculate. The long and short of it is DNRC has continued to issue around between 2,000 and 3,000 exempt well certificates per year since that litigation. We've also seen attempts in almost every legislative session to reopen the loophole and go back to that challenge definition of combined appropriation. We saw House Bill 339 in 2017, which was ultimately vetoed. And then we saw draft bills in 2019 and 2021 as well, brought on behalf of the well drillers and development industry in general. But those were never introduced in the last 2 sessions. This is a slide I want that just illustrates the point that I was discussing. You can see that things really ramped up after 1991 in that right after the new DNRC rule went into effect. You can see in the early 2000s, there were some huge spikes in the number of wells, but after the court rulings, things kind of cooled off, but they started to tick back up again. as developers found new ways to creatively get around the permitting requirement and continue to use exempt wells wherever possible. And when we look at the cumulative impacts here, it becomes even more apparent that we have a problem, right? So beginning in 1991, there were already about 57,000 exempt wells in the state. And you can see just the numbers continually climb year after year based on development pressures in Montana. And as long as there's a loophole in the permitting requirement, I think it's safe to say that it will be abused. I wanted to show some slides too from this the state of Washington, which it's sort of a cautionary tale. They had a similar exempt well loophole in place before that. Their loophole was addressed via a couple of court decisions from their state Supreme Court and subsequent legislation. But it really does, as you go through, starting in the 70s here, and look at the number of exempt wells that are being drilled as their state grew in population. It's pretty alarming, right? As we get to the 90s into the 2000s. And then this is the most recent slide we have, is from 2010. You can point out those red dots on the map are actually, that's where there's between 56 and 80 exempt wells per a 40-acre chunk of property. So obviously, if there's a loophole in place, it's going to be abused until somebody says enough is enough. So we don't have similar data for the state of Montana, but I think, and it's not a directly apples to apples comparison as well. There's a huge population difference between the state of Washington and the state of Montana. Washington's like 7.7 million people, and Montana's got just over 1 million. But there's no disputing the fact that Montana is growing rapidly, right? So this is we can kind of glean some similar context here from this study that Headwaters Economics did, looking at the number of single family homes in Montana, and they tracked it by decade as well. But I'll just show this slide for the number of homes in 1900 versus 2018. So these are some pretty, sobering statistics that came out of their study. 1/4 of all homes in Montana were constructed since the year 2000. Nearly half the homes built between 1990 and 2018 were constructed on large lots. So these are the lots that can avail themselves of an exempt well. And again, 60% of all these homes were constructed outside of incorporated areas, meaning they're not relying on municipal water supplies. They're drilling their own well. So it's safe to say, that a good chunk, certainly more than 60%, right around 60% or so of these new homes have relied on exempt wells in Montana. So given this cautionary tale, what's the next steps? What are we going to do about exempt well policy in the future? I think there's a serious argument to be made that the exemption is not, and perhaps was never, compatible with the Montana Water Use Act or our water needs. Moreover, given the stresses of climate change and population growth, we simply cannot continue to hand out permit-free groundwater appropriations in the state of Montana. So at a minimum, the current exemption that exists in the law, we need to make sure it stays as narrow as possible in order to avoid potential abuse. Lo and behold, we do have a couple of draft bills already proposed to reopen the loophole, at least to some extent. And I'll just talk about them briefly here. The first one, what this one would do, it's just in draft form right now. And I've been working with the bill sponsor on some amendments, but what it would do is guarantee 10 acre feet of water for an exempt well that serves a public water supply system. So that's a system that has at least 15 service connections or serves at least 25 people for domestic supply. That's not the worst thing in the world. especially when you compare that to the possibility of drilling one well for each one of those homes. But it still needs some sideboards on it to prevent abuse. We need to make sure that this water right, if it's being handed out, is actually being used. It needs to be verified, needs to be measured. So working on some amendments on that policy. But the real concerning one here is the next one, LC 1040, which would take us right back to square one. It would remove any limitation or consideration of combined appropriation at all in our policy and widen the loophole to extend to phase subdivisions and also what are called family transfer parcels that those are parcels of land that you can transfer to immediate family members without going through any subdivision review. So there's some real problems with these as they're drafted right now. And certainly if that second one moves forward and is introduced, we'll be opposing it and we'll likely be contacting you folks as well. So I just wanted to mention, sticking with our theme, good, bad, and ugly, I got a new category here for the hideously ugly, because we are also want to make sure that we're tracking any potential changes to our Constitution. One of the things that a supermajority can do is propose constitutional referendums. If they get 2/3 of both houses, they can get those on the ballot. They ultimately do have to be approved by the voters of Montana, but they can propose essentially whatever they want. So we've seen about 55 draft constitutional referendums out there right now. Only 2 of those have been introduced. But one of the drafts does aim to revise our clean and healthful environment of the Montana Constitution. This is enormously important. And given the sponsor of that draft, I would venture a guess that the revisions are not going to be good for our environment. So we need to track this, and we will be contacting all of you to stand up in support of our Constitution if and when any of these proposals go forward. With that, I think I'm a little bit over time, but just wanted to, again, thank you for your time and attention tonight and putting up with our technical difficulties. And I think we'll just move right into questions.
And for questions, Andrew, if you could stop sharing your screen, then we can see more people. If you have a question and you don't want to turn on your video or you don't have audio, you can type it in the chat, or you can turn on your video and wave at me and I can call on you and we can answer any questions. Alex and Andrew can jump in here with their knowledge. You'll also see that Julia dropped a link to our 2023 legislative session resources page on our website, and we will continue to update that throughout the session. Evan, yeah, go ahead.
I'll go for it. So considering you were looking at the the center pivot and then the subdivision that had all the exempt wells, and there's no metering, no data on how much maybe more water the subdivisions are using than the permit. Is there any estimations that would be on how much more the exempt wells are using?
That's a good question. So the current law says you don't have to measure or have a meter on your exempt well, but it still has a theoretical cap of 10 acre feet of water per year is the maximum volume. 10 acre feet is a lot of water. So a typical domestic home will use less than 2 acre feet. And that includes, some wiggle room maybe for lawn and garden irrigation. But 10 acre feet is a substantial amount of water. And if each one of those homes has its own well, and you have, maybe a 35, 40 lot subdivision, that's a substantial amount of water. It's certainly, I would say, more than would be used for pivot irrigation going on that neighboring lot. I do know that the Montana Bureau of Mines and Geology has dug into groundwater uses in some areas of the state and has data to kind of try to get a better picture of what we're seeing in terms of total consumptive use via exempt wells. But we don't have a ton of data, and we don't have any that I'm aware of for the Clark Fork Basin specifically. But we know it's a problem, and currently, right now, it's not being measured really at all. So, good point, good question.
So, in all of this information is new to me. So, in 2017, the Montana Supreme Court said that you can no longer, like, exempt wells are invalid, though the DNRC continues to grant exempt wells, but nothing's been done to stop them from continuing to grant exempt wells?
Yeah, so what the Supreme Court said in its decision was that the definition of combined appropriation that was in place was unlawful and contrary to the Montana Water Use Act. And so at that point, what the DNRC did was go back to its previous definition of combined appropriation. So it says if you are putting in any two or more wells from in the same project, let's say, that's a combined appropriation. You got to get a permit. But what the DNRC has also said is you can put in individual wells, and if you space them out enough, they won't consider that to be a combined appropriation. And so that's how the loophole continues to be used right now. If developers can space out their wells enough, it's usually about every quarter mile or so, then they can continue to kind of put in as many as they want. And the other thing that they've done, the developers have done, is propose their subdivisions in phases, and DNRC is allowing them to get essentially one exempt appropriation or 10 acre feet of water total per phase. But you can have as many phases as you want. And so that's a problem too. And that's a concern that we have currently. We'd like to see that tightened up. Unfortunately, the legislation that we've seen proposed this session would take us in the other direction and kind of widen that loophole even more. So it's a problem.
Andrew, Wayne Davis asked in the chat, is there any support from agriculture interests in stopping exempt wells?
Yes, Wayne, that's an excellent point. When we brought our litigation on this issue, we were joined by several senior water rights holders who are concerned about impacts, especially cumulative impacts of exempt wells on their existing water rights. I think that the number one, contingent of water users in the state of Montana that should be concerned about this issue are ag folks, irrigators with senior water rights. Right now, they don't even get notice of these proposals. They don't get any opportunity to object or weigh in on behalf of their property rights. So it's an enormous impact to them. And I think the other thing that exempt well policy does is it flips the burden of proof onto the senior water right users to sort of prove that these proposals are going to impact them, rather than the new proponent or the new developer having the burden to show that their proposal isn't going to impact senior water rights holders, which is how our Water Use Act is designed to work. So there are a number of problems, but I think we're going to need the ag folks to speak up on behalf of these bad exempt well bills as well.
Thank you. William Andrews, I saw you turned on your video. Did you have a question? You're no. Okay. He's just saying hi. That's very nice. It's nice to see humans. Lily Haynes, she's on our Clark Fork team. She's got a question in the chat here. She says, on the CFC legislative session resource page, there's a link to committee information. If we want to watchdog water bills in committee, what committees should we check out?
Yeah, thanks, Lily. So most of the time we're tracking the Natural Resource Committee. So there's a Senate Natural Resources Committee on the Senate side. And then the same thing, the House Natural Resources on the House side. Occasionally, we'll see bills related to land use pop up in local government. So Senate and House local government. And occasionally we'll have bills that we're tracking in, like that in-stream flow bill that I talked would possibly end up in House Fish, Wildlife, and Parks or Senate Fish and Game. But kind of those general committees are the ones that we'll be paying the most attention to. And for anyone who hasn't been to the legislature's website, it is pretty easy to tune in and watch and listen to all of the committee activity. It's a little bit overwhelming in terms of the amount of activity, and that tends to ramp up as we get further into the session. But it's an excellent resource for those who want to actually tune in and track and testify remotely. That's an option as well.
And if you look at that resource page, there's also a couple of bill tracker tools that other people have created that we link to right at the top. And the first one is the Montana Environmental Information Center, and they're tracking environmental bills. So if you want something that kind of filters it down for you right from the start, theirs is a great one to start with. Okay, it sounds like questions are kind of winding down. So at this point, I would love to introduce you to Julia Crocker. She is our community programs coordinator. She does outreach for Clark Fork Coalition, and she's one of our bill trackers on our policy team. She's also got a great mind for connecting data and people. So we've got a survey that we're going to drop in the chat here. And Julia will talk to you a little bit more about the questions we're asking you and why. Julia.
Yeah. So, hey, everyone. As Sam said, my name's Julia Crocker, and I'm the Community Programs Coordinator. This will be my first legislative session with CFC, and I'm super excited to not only be working with the people within our organization, but also this amazing group of water watchdogs that we have signed up. This webinar will be shared with the water watchdogs who weren't able to attend this evening. Sam will be linking right now the survey into the chat, so be sure to fill this out. And what this survey does is, as we continue to track and monitor these bills that Alex and Andrew discussed, we may call on our water watchdogs to email, call representatives, or testify at key times. And so you'll put that information to kind of gauge your comfort level for what you want to do. So this survey provides us with information that will help us quickly and effectively respond to this type of legislative activity. So as you fill out this survey, if there's something specific you'd like to share with CFC, maybe a strength you have, or if you have a specific question that maybe you didn't want to ask in the chat or ask Andrew or Alex tonight, you can put that in the survey and I'll be sure to get those answered. And my information is in there. So if you have something pop up in a couple weeks, feel free to reach out to me. And we've also linked the CFC 2023 legislative resource page, and you can find that on our website. But yeah, if you have any other information question, my email's in there. It's just julia@clarkfork.org. And yeah, thanks for taking time this evening to join us. And I look forward to working with you during this session.
And you can find all of this at clarkfork.org too, if you don't catch this here. But yes, we are standing by. Karen, do you want to hop on and say a few words?
Yeah, you bet, Sam. Thank you. But yeah, thank you so much, everybody, for joining us this evening for this briefing. We are super excited that you'll be rolling up your sleeves with us this session to defend and improve a policy toolbox that we do rely on to ensure the best possible future for our rivers. As we like to say, these are the rivers that sustain people, fish, and wildlife, and they're central to really everything that we care about in Montana. And as we've seen session after session, uphill battle after uphill battle, your involvement is indispensable. It's testimonies, calls, comments to lawmakers, reminding them of the central importance of clean water. They have real impact. So thank you so much. We're incredibly grateful for your involvement. As we've talked about, our policy team has created some nifty, easy to use tools to help you weigh in this session. But if you ever have any questions about any bills or messaging to lawmakers, please don't hesitate to reach out the old-fashioned way. We have phones. We use emails. So And we have an office that's open these days, which is still an adjustment for us after the last couple of years, but feel free to be in touch in a variety of different ways. It's just important that you have the information that you need to feel comfortable weighing in at the session this year. So thanks again. And Sam, I'll turn it back to you.
Okay. Thanks everyone so much. Like I said, this is just the start, so we will keep in touch. Thank you for your time tonight, and we will talk to you soon.